The news didn't just come out. It exploded, shaking Genoa City like a crack in the ground finally breaking. At the center of it all was Audra Charles, sharp-mouthed, always dressed to impress, always thinking several steps ahead. She stood in the Newman Enterprises atrium, one hand on her stomach, eyes wet but steady. In one breath she changed everything. She announced she was pregnant and that she was leaving the Young and the Restless, leaving her co-workers, leaving the fight she had mastered, leaving behind a legacy built on ambition, betrayal, and a relentless drive that never let up. The silence after her words was louder than any shouting match in the boardroom, louder than all the gossip already spreading through town. No one expected Audra, the woman who turned weakness into strength, who sold desire like a product, who made power smell like perfume and deals feel like victories, to be the one saying goodbye, and certainly not like this, with a baby growing inside her that demanded a new path, a new kind of fight. Nate Hastings stood frozen a few feet away, the question of who the father was hanging between them like a knife. Memories of secret looks and shared nights flashed across his face. Meanwhile, Victoria Newman's jaw clenched, not just from jealousy, but from the sudden truth that Audra had outsmarted them all once again, by walking away on her own terms. This wasn't a firing or a fall from grace. It was a choice, deliberate and shocking. As whispers filled the air, "Is it Nate's?" The truth was about to change everything. When did she know? Why now? Audra lifted her chin and thanked them, thanked every rival who made her stronger, every ally who didn't take her seriously, every enemy who showed her the cost of delaying. Her voice steady even as tears came close, because she was done pretending that winning only happened with blood on the floor. Somewhere in the crowd, Sally Spectra felt a moment of understanding, recognizing the strength it took to walk away from a place that still wanted you. Phyllis Summers narrowed her eyes, already thinking about a story that would shake Genoa City to its core. Kyle Abbott shared a glance with Jack, both sensing the end of an era, because Audra had been a change, a challenge, a mirror to everyone's worst sides. And now that mirror was breaking as she spoke of motherhood not as a flaw but as a reckoning. She admitted that for the first time, she was scared not of losing control but of holding something too important to risk. When she turned to Nate, just for a moment, their past history flickered with unsaid words and paths not taken. His regret meeting her determination, because whatever they had been or could have been, was now secondary to a life she wouldn't settle for. As she spoke directly to the fans, her thanks came out honest and raw, thanking them for loving her, hating her, talking about her, because Audra Charles had never lived quietly, and she wasn't going to vanish without giving credit to the people who made her matter. She promised that this goodbye wasn't the end but a new beginning, that women like her don't disappear, they change. The applause that finally came was loud and mixed, some clapping out of respect, some from shock, some from sadness for the chaos she created. Others stood in disbelief, realizing too late that the game had changed and a queen had chosen to walk away instead of playing on. Later, in the quiet places where deals were once made and secrets planned, Audra stayed, touching the glass, saying goodbye to offices that had watched her rise, remembering nights driven by ambition and mornings won through smart choices. Her phone buzzed with messages she didn't open, because closure needed silence. When she stepped outside into the cold Genoa City air, wrapping her coat around her, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight and excitement of the future inside her. She knew that behind her, the town would keep moving, alliances would break, secrets would come out, and her name would be talked about with both curiosity and longing. But ahead was a different story, one that hadn't been written yet and wasn't up for negotiation. As she walked away, head high, heart full, past old loves and lingering anger, Audra Charles showed that the biggest surprise wasn't her pregnancy or her leaving, but the decision to walk away from power for something more meaningful. She left not in shame or loss but in victory that felt tender, a dramatic ending that would stay with Genoa City long after the doors closed behind her, leaving everyone else to deal with the space she had chosen to create and the truth that sometimes, the boldest move is knowing when to say goodbye. The day after Audra Charles left Genoa City didn't come quietly. It crept in slowly like a judgment, with pale light coming through the windows of offices and luxury apartments. It was as if the town itself was checking to see what was left, because her absence felt heavy, like something important had been lost. Conversations felt forced, and people's eyes met with more intensity than usual. At Newman Enterprises, the usual rhythm of work felt fake, Like everyone was pretending to be in a play that had ended before the main character left the stage. Nate Hastings sat alone in his office watching the city he no longer recognized, going over Audra's words again and again until they stopped sounding like goodbye and started feeling more like a challenge. Being pregnant hadn't made her softer, it had made her clearer, and that clarity was painful, especially when the unspoken question of whether the child was his came back to him like a secret wanting to be heard. Across town, Victoria Newman called an emergency meeting not for answers, but to take control. Her voice was sharp and clear as she demanded people to focus, to move forward, and to make sure Audra Charles didn't influence their plans anymore. But every slide on the screen felt like a placeholder, and every projection reminded her that Audra had been the one who created the disruption, and now the plan was incomplete. As people started talking about replacements, damage control, and how things looked, Victoria felt something she hadn't expected: respect. It wasn't jealousy, but a quiet acknowledgement that Audra had chosen something that money and power couldn't buy. Meanwhile, Sally Spectra sat with her coffee, thinking out loud to Chloe about whether bravery always looks like loss before it looks like freedom. Audra's departure had made her think about how long ambition could pretend to be destiny. Chloe, usually practical, shrugged but listened because even the most cynical people could feel the change. Phyllis Summers, always keen on uncovering secrets, started spreading rumors carefully, trying to find out who the child's father was. A mystery like that was like fuel in Genoa City, and if Audra thought she could leave without consequences, Phyllis was ready to write the next part of the story. When Phyllis approached Nate with a smile that wasn't friendly, he said nothing, and the look in his eyes told more than words ever could. Silence in Genoa City often meant something more than just silence. The whispers reached Jack Abbott, who stopped in the hallway of the Abbott mansion, feeling like history was repeating itself. Women were leaving to save themselves, and men were left to think about the cost of power. Jack, older and wiser, wondered if Audra's exit wasn't the end, but a warning. Cal felt a type of envy he didn't want to admit. He envied the confidence of someone who knew when to walk away, like certainty was a luxury that wasn't available anymore. Elsewhere, away from the noise, Audra lay in a quiet hotel room, listening to her own breathing and imagining the rhythm beneath it. Her hand rested where the future felt like it should be acknowledged. Her phone lit up with a message: Nate's name, no anger, no demands, just a simple question. She closed her eyes because restraint was always the hardest thing for her. Saying yes or no would open doors she had closed on purpose. But motherhood had changed the rules, not by forgetting the past, but by making her choose what to carry forward. As dawn came, she made her decision. She sent a reply that wasn't a yes or a no, but a chance for honesty when the time was right. Because Audra Charles was done living in half-truths. Back in Genoa City, the message spread and the air felt charged. People started feeling like alliances were fragile and victories seemed empty. The town sensed that a reckoning was still coming. Audra's absence meant more than peace, it meant change. The empty space she left demanded something to fill it. Secrets would come out faster than lies could be hidden. Nate might have to face the possibility that the biggest legacy he could leave wasn't a career, but a child. Victoria would have to rethink what power really meant. Sally might finally look for a life that wasn't just about ambition. And Phyllis, as always, would dig for the truth, only to find that even the biggest scandal couldn't match the quiet strength of a woman who chose herself. As the day went on and the sun set behind the city, Genoa City realized too late that Audra Charles hadn't walked away. She had changed the game entirely, leaving behind a question that felt like a heartbeat, a future that would return, not as a scandal, but as a truth that couldn't be controlled. Some chapters don't end, they wait, growing stronger in silence, ready to take their place in the story. Genoa City learned quickly that silence could be louder than scandal, because in the days after Audra Charles vanished from its glossy corridors and ruthless agendas, the town began to fracture along invisible seams, each person hearing their own version of her absence, their own echo of what she had taken with her. And at Newman Enterprises, the facade of normalcy cracked when a confidential audit, one Audra had quietly initiated before leaving, surfaced with explosive implications, exposing strategic vulnerabilities no one else had seen or dared to confront, and suddenly the question was no longer why she left but what she had left behind. While Victoria Newman paced like a general surveying a battlefield she no longer fully controlled, realizing too late that Audra's final move had not been departure but preparation, a chessboard set for consequences, and as executives scrambled to contain the fallout, Victoria felt the unnerving sensation of being outmaneuvered by someone who wasn't even in the room because Audra's fingerprints were everywhere, subtle and undeniable, while Nate Hastings, caught between boardroom chaos and a private reckoning, found his composure slipping as a sealed envelope arrived at his door, Audra's handwriting unmistakable, the weight of it heavier than paper, inside not answers but boundaries, a letter written with surgical clarity stating that the child's paternity would be confirmed not by rumor or pressure but by time and trust, and that, until then Nate would have to decide who he wanted to be without guarantees, and the restraint in her words hurt more than accusation ever could, forcing Nate to confront a truth he'd long avoided. That ambition had taught him how to climb but not how to stay, and as he folded the letter with shaking hands, the town around him buzzed with speculation reaching fever pitch, because Phyllis Summers had caught wind of the audit and smelled blood, connecting dots with gleeful precision, leaking just enough to set the internet ablaze with theories about Audra's pregnancy, her exit, and the possibility that Newman Enterprises itself had been destabilized by a woman everyone thought was replaceable, while Jack Abbott watched the storm gather with a familiar heaviness, recognizing the pattern of history circling back, women leaving to save themselves while men argued over ownership of the aftermath, and Jack's warning to Kyle, soft but firm, about mistaking possession for partnership landed harder than expected because Kyle had been feeling the same unease, the sense that something essential had shifted, that Audra's choice had exposed how fragile their definitions of success really were, and across town at Society, Sally Spectra found herself defending Audra in conversations she hadn't intended to start, pushing back against the narrative that painted pregnancy as retreat, insisting it was evolution, and the conviction in her voice surprised even her, because it echoed a truth she was only beginning to accept for herself, while Chloe listened more than she joked, sensing that this was not just Audra's story rippling outward but a reckoning for all of them. And then came the moment that split the town cleanly in two, when confidential medical information, illegally obtained and recklessly shared, hit the rumor mill, hinting that Audra's pregnancy timeline overlapped precisely with her last intimate connection to Nate, igniting a firestorm of judgment and assumption, and Nate, blindsided and furious, confronted Phyllis in a public setting, his restraint finally snapping as he accused her of crossing a line that could not be uncrossed, his voice shaking not with guilt but with fear for a child not yet born, and the room froze, because in that instant the question was no longer gossip but responsibility, and Phyllis, for once, felt the sting of having gone too far, though she would never admit it, while Victoria, watching from a distance, realized the damage was now personal, no longer abstract, and wondered if Audra had left not to escape consequences but to protect something fragile from a town that devoured weakness, and far away, in a quiet place where Audra had begun to build a different kind of routine, she felt the shift before she heard about it, the instinctive tightening in her chest that told her Genoa City was circling again, and when the news reached her, anger flared, not for herself but for the life she was safeguarding, and she made a decision that surprised even her, booking a return not to reclaim power but to set terms, because Audra Charles did not flee storms, she redirected them, and her arrival back in Genoa City was anything but subtle, her presence commanding attention the moment she stepped into a crowded room, visibly pregnant now, unflinching under the weight of stares, choosing transparency over secrecy as she addressed the rumors head-on, condemning the violations, drawing a line no one was allowed to cross. And when she looked directly at Nate and told him the truth, that yes, the child could be his, but that fatherhood would be earned through integrity, not entitlement, the room seemed to exhale all at once, because this was not the Audra they had known, sharpened solely by ambition. This was a woman forged by choice, and the applause that followed was hesitant at first, then undeniable, while Victoria watched with something close to awe, understanding at last that Audra's power had never been about leverage but clarity, and as Genoa City absorbed this new reality, one where Audra Charles returned not as a player but as a force defining her own narrative, the town realized the story was no longer about a pregnancy or a farewell, but about accountability, legacy, and the kind of strength that doesn't conquer rooms but changes them, and in that moment, as alliances shifted and truths stood exposed under unforgiving lights, everyone understood that the most dangerous chapters were still ahead because Audra had come back not to resume the game, but to rewrite the rules, and Genoa City was not ready for the consequences of a woman who knew exactly what she was protecting and exactly what she was willing to burn to do it. The moment Audra Charles returned to Genoa City, visibly pregnant and unmistakably unbowed, the air itself seemed to tighten, because this was no victory lap and no retreat but a reckoning. And as she stood in the familiar glow of flashing cameras and whispering onlookers, one hand steady at her side and the other instinctively resting over the life she carried, she understood with crystal clarity that the town had already written its version of her story, and she had come back to erase it, word by word, as Nate Hastings felt the full weight of her presence like a physical force, guilt and hope warring in his chest while unspoken questions hovered between them, questions about bloodlines and responsibility and whether ambition had cost him the chance to be ready for something real, while Victoria Newman watched with narrowed eyes and a recalculating mind, realizing that Audra's departure had never been weakness but strategy, and that her return was not about reclaiming power but redefining it, because Audra spoke not in accusations but in boundaries, condemning the rumors, the violations, the hunger for scandal that had turned her pregnancy into entertainment, her voice calm yet lethal as she made it clear that her child would not be collateral damage in Genoa City's endless wars, and the crowd, accustomed to spectacle, fell silent in the face of conviction, because this was a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect, while Phyllis Summers, uncharacteristically subdued, felt the sting of having pushed too far, realizing too late that some stories bite back, and Sally Spectra watched with something like admiration, recognizing the rare courage it took to stand unarmored and still command the room, and as Audra turned to Nate and acknowledged aloud that yes, the child could be his, but that fatherhood was not a title bestowed by biology but a role earned through consistency and truth, Nate's composure finally cracked, his eyes shining with a mixture of fear and resolve as he nodded, understanding that this was not a demand but an invitation to become better, and in that fragile electric pause, Genoa City shifted, alliances wobbling as old definitions of power suddenly felt hollow, because Audra was no longer fighting to win rooms or deals or lovers, she was fighting for a future that could not be negotiated away, and as she walked out again, this time not in secrecy but in full view, her departure carried a different weight, not final but conditional, leaving behind a town forced to confront the cost of its cruelty and the limits of its control, while behind her conversations erupted, plans were redrawn, and reputations quietly re-evaluated, because Audra Charles had done the unthinkable. She had exposed that the greatest threat to Genoa City was not betrayal or scandal, but a woman who knew exactly who she was, exactly what she wanted, and exactly how little she needed their approval to claim it.